Hi, I'm Scott Leadingham. Thanks for joining us here in the unique Northwest. 2019 comes to a close and 2020 is upon us, and that gives us cause to reflect back on some of our favorite stories of the year. Indeed, there are many, but we only have so much time here, so we'll highlight three that we would like to show you. First, the Bundyville podcast came out several years ago and it examined the Bundy family, who were famous for their anti-government views and the takeover of the Malheur National Wildlife Refuge in 2016. The second season came out this past year and it delved not just into the Bundy family, but much deeper about anti-extremist views in the West and the inland Northwest. In particular, the podcast looked at Matt Shay, a Republican state representative for Washington State, and some of his views and how he has participated in parts of this movement. We talked with podcast host Leah Satilli about what the podcast was about and how Matt Shay figured into it.
So Matt Shay was someone that I was familiar with just from having been a reporter in the Northwest, and I wrote a story about him for Rolling Stone last year, particularly because I'd been investigating the Patriot movement and the Bundys, and Matt Shay, as you say, the state representative from Spokane Valley, kept showing up at these events. He was at the 2014 Bunkerville standoff in Nevada. He was at the 2016 occupation of the Malheur National Wildlife Refuge, and in the ensuing years, he's continued to appear alongside Lavoy Finicum's widow on stage at Patriot events. He continues to amp up his rhetoric about conspiracy theories and white supremacist talking points, and he continues to stay in office. He's been in office for 12 years. He just was reelected last year in 2018.
You mentioned this in the podcast. I think it was kind of poignant, where you essentially said that you're not sure that people aren't paying attention, they don't care, or they agree with him, and you're not sure which one is more disconcerting or something like that. Is that what you would say?
It's hard to say, because when you look at the numbers, not a lot of people actually come out to vote in his district. So he has a very small group of people that is voting for him, and he's getting in because no one else is running that is a viable candidate, and a lot of people just aren't voting. So the people who may be pretty outraged about some of the things that he believes aren't showing up.
As 2019 closes, so does an internal investigative report into Republican Matt Shay and whether he engaged in, quote, political violence. That report has been delivered to State House legislative leaders, but it has not yet been made public as we tape this. When it is made public, we'll have more information on our website, nwpb.org. And from the political to the possibly unexplained, earlier this year we talked to correspondent Anna King, who was in Eastern Oregon, looking at unexplained cattle deaths and the mysteries and all the outlandish theories, frankly, around them that were being called into the local sheriff's office.
Down in Southeast Oregon, there was 5 young bulls were killed, and they were in really remote country. I was actually able to go up with a rancher into a really remote part of this ranch and see one of these mutilated bulls. The cattle have missing genitals, tongues, and blood, but the rest of the animals are totally untouched. We were on a ranch the size roughly of Chicago, and we had to drive for more than like an hour and a half to get to this animal. The investigators say that these animals are not the victims of poisonous plants, let's say, that sometimes can kill animals on the rangeland. They weren't the victims of a cougar. They weren't the victims of other predators. They weren't, shot. So the way in which these animals were killed is really mysterious. In fact, no coyotes, rodents, buzzards, or any other kind of bird really were touching the animals that I went and saw. That's really unusual in this kind of country. Usually an animal doesn't last for more than a day or even a week out in this kind of country, and nothing was touching them. Something was wrong. And these crimes are happening in such remote country that people know every pickup. People know the people that should be there and shouldn't be there in the landscape. They're their neighbors, because it's such remote country. There's not very many people. So people see things, and no tracks, no weird people have been seen. And this has happened like this in other places in the West. And in fact, since my story came out, people are contacting me, telling me about their stories and sending me pictures of their animals that this has happened to. So it's really disturbing for the people that this has happened to. They don't forget the experience, and they always wonder what happened.
So that's some of the how and the where this is happening, and you alluded to it, but just expand a little bit more on some of the maybe outlandish or out of the ordinary theories that have been called in to particularly the Harney County Sheriff's Office there in Oregon. What have you seen and what have they heard from callers?
So after they started getting calls at the Harney County Sheriff's Office on this case, when it became public, they started this whiteboard where they wrote in green marker all of the different things that people are saying that it could be. And so people are saying, aliens, Bigfoot, the North Vietnamese Army, alien ships, sharks with laser beams. There's a lot of outlandish theories out there. People are really wondering what this could be.
So obviously some outlandish theories, but something is causing this. And for those involved, the ranchers who are having this happen to them now and in the past, you talked to one who it happened to in the 80s, how are they feeling? Like, what does it do to them and their nerves and how they sleep at night and things like that?
I talked to several people in person that this has happened to, and the thing that I came away with from all of those discussions is that these are solid ranching people. They're very grounded people. They don't believe in a lot of outlandish things. They're skeptics. They're, generally Republican. They're just really grounded people. And when I talked to them, they weren't saying it wasn't aliens. Like, each one that I spoke to, they almost whispered it. They didn't want to say it. But it was like, it's so weird and it's so disturbing and it's so awful that they don't know who or what committed these crimes.
As an indication of how widely that story spread, it was picked up by multiple national and international outlets, including by NPR. And when it did, it was the top viewed story on NPR.org during that time, and it made the list of NPR's top viewed stories of 2019. From cattle on rangeland to fish swimming in rivers, we often joke around here that everything can be boiled down to salmon, dams, or wolves. And indeed, much of what Courtney Flatt covers involves those topics. She covers natural resources and the environment. And one of the stories she covered this year was about salmon being reintroduced behind Grand Coulee and Chief Joseph dams on the upper Columbia River, and why the Colville tribe was so happy to see that happen.
When those dams were built, there was no fish passage built along with them, nothing like salmon ladders or anything like that. So they effectively blocked all of these hundreds of miles of streams and salmon habitat from salmon that needed to migrate up or down river. Since Grand Coulee was built in the 1930s and Chief Joseph was built in the 1950s. Back a long time ago, about 80 years ago, the tribes even had a ceremony of tears at Kettle Falls in northeastern Washington when the last run of salmon made it past the dam's construction. And so they've been fighting really for decades and decades to get salmon to be released beyond these dams, to be in these traditional historical habitat. And in fact, they even started a nearby hatchery to help achieve that goal. It's really kind of been recently a matter of funding, and there are still some questions to answer, things like diseases and invasive species, and just a few other questions they need to answer. And so that's why they're planning on some experimental releases in the years to come, kind of smaller releases and larger releases, just to see what happens. And so that's kind of the next steps in the process.
So you, Courtney, talked to a lot of people while you were there on site reporting this story. And from a cultural aspect, it was, of course, very important to the Colville tribal members who you talked to. Can you just talk about some of their experiences and what they said to you about how important this day was for them?
Yeah, and so it was really kind of an emotional thing just to watch the first salmon be released into this river where salmon hadn't been since the 1950s. So what they did is they kind of lined up shoulder to shoulder and passed salmon in these really large kind of rubbery bags from the truck that had hauled them from the hatchery to the river, and then people were able to hold the fish one at a time and let them go into the river. Some kind of like splashed around, and some just took off immediately. So people were really emotional. They didn't have many words to describe what exactly they were feeling. They said that the salmon were coming home finally, and were just really overjoyed that maybe in a few years they'd be able to fish for salmon here, and definitely, hopefully, their grandchildren would eventually be able to fish for salmon in these traditional places.
As a tag to that topic on salmon, dams, and the Columbia River, the United States and Canada are currently renegotiating the Columbia River Treaty. Courtney has been covering those negotiations, which are ongoing. You can find out more about that at nwpb.org, along with all of these stories that we have covered this year. Thank you for joining us here in the unique Northwest.